And the Marine Corps was, for me, an opportunity to gain self-reliance, an opportunity to gain discipline and focus, and to gain a greater sense of myself, greater confidence in who I was as a person. So it contributed to that, and it also gave me an opportunity to go to college.
Fort Des Moines was initially founded as a base for the cavalry, housing black troops who fought in the Mexican War in 1916. In 1917, the first officer candidate class of African Americans in U.S. military history trained at Fort Des Moines, where they received their commissions. In 1917, a training camp for black medical personnel began, and in 1918, the fort was used for the treatment of World War I casualties. With the entry of the United States into World War II, the fort was also used as a training center for women for service in the Army Women's Army Corps. Despite the eagerness demonstrated by blacks to join the fight, black enlistees were limited by the federal government. At the same time, political pressure from a number of black organizations, including the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, pushed for black officer training. Government officials, however, feared the race issue would harm the war effort. A compromise was reached by allowing one officer candidate school to open to black college graduates. The announcement was made that 1,000 black officers would be trained. All black Howard University in Washington, D.C. wanted to be the host camp. But government officials believed that the black cadets would fail and feared the media in the eastern United States would rush to cover the story about the military's embarrassment. A number of important national and local leaders were among the cadet class, including Elder Watson Diggs, who had co-founded Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity in 1911. Frank Coleman and Edgar Love had done the same thing for Omega Psi Phi fraternity the same year. Cadet lawyers Samuel Joe Brown, Charles Howard, and James Morris would go on to co-found the National Bar Association in 1925. On July 30, 1965, a jury found the defendant Ray Crump Jr. not guilty in an 8-day trial in the United States District Court in Washington that had charged him with the October 12, 1964 execution-style shooting of Mary Pinchot Meyer, a Washington socialite said to have been a former lover of President John F. Kennedy. Raymond Crump Jr. was a slight, intellectually fragile, poor black man of 24. His attorney was W. Roundtree Johnson. Katie McCabe, the co-author of Miss Roundtree's memoir, Justice Older Than the Law, said she was a one-woman legal aid society before people used that term. On a perfect day, October in 1964, homicide squad cars were called to the towpath along the C&O Canal in the upscale Georgetown area of Washington, D.C. The police found a man in the woods down by the river. His name was Ray Crump Jr., and he was black, his clothes were wet, and he had cut his hand. When Mary Meyer died, no one knew about her affair with John Kennedy or about her ex-husband's job managing the CIA clandestine services. Mary, 43, was a Georgetown artist, born to a wealthy Pennsylvania family, daughter of Amos Pinchot, the progressive lawyer, and niece of Gifford Pinchot, conservationist and Teddy Roosevelt's chief forester. Her younger sister, Toni, was married to Ben Bradley, then of Newsweek, later of the Washington Post. It was Bradley who identified the body at the morgue. Miss Roundtree's victory in the Crump case was not her first noteworthy accomplishment. As an inaugural member of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, later the Women's Army Corps, she became, in 1942, one of the first women of any race to be commissioned an Army officer. Attaining the rank of captain, she personally recruited scores of African American women for wartime Army service. As a Washington lawyer, she helped secure a landmark ban on racial segregation in interstate bus travel in a case that originated in 1952, 3 years before Rosa Parks refused to yield her seat in Montgomery, Alabama. Encouraged by a friend of her grandmother's, the distinguished black educator Mary McLeod Bethune, young Dovey Johnson set her sights on becoming a doctor. She enrolled at Spelman College and graduated in 1938, a double major in English and biology with the intent of going to medical school. With no money for medical school, she spent the next 3 years teaching 7th and 8th grade in Chester, South Carolina. In 1941, she made her way to Washington, D.C. in Dr. Bethune's office at the National Council of Negro Women. At that time, Dr. Bethune and her close friend Eleanor Roosevelt were pressing for the creation of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which would admit a cohort of women for training as Army officers. Dr. Bethune helped ensure that 40 of the 440 women in that cohort would be black. The Corps was established in 1942, and Dovey Johnson joined up reporting for training at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. And on the base, Miss Roundtree risked court-martial by confronting white commanding officers about segregationist practices, including colored-only tables in the mess hall. In that effort, she was successful, and the signs came down. Outside the base was harder still. In 1943, on a recruiting trip through the South, Miss Roundtree, in uniform, was ordered to relinquish her seat on a Miami bus to a white Marine. Threatened with arrest, she was forced to disembark. Such episodes, she later said, marked the start of her interest in the law as a tool of social justice. In 1947, she entered Howard University's law school on the GI Bill, one of only 5 women in her class. Miss Roundtree graduated from law school in 1950 and was admitted to the bar of District of Columbia in the next year. In 1962, despite a storm of protest from its members, she became the first African American admitted to the Women's Bar Association of the District of Columbia. Then, in 1952, she took on a case that would quietly become a landmark, Sarah Keyes versus Carolina Coach Company. Sarah Louise Keyes was a young black private in the Women's Army Corps. Earlier that year, in uniform, she had traveled by bus from Fort Dixon, New Jersey, to her home in North Carolina. In Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina, a new driver ordered her to give up her seat to a white Marine, just as Mrs. Roundtree had been told to do so years before. Miss Keyes demurred and was arrested and jailed for disorderly conduct. In early 1953, the United States District Court for the District of Columbia dismissed the Keyes suit on jurisdictional grounds, but because Miss Keyes' journey had involved the crossing of state lines, Miss Roundtree and Mr. Robertson realized that they might properly plead the case before the Interstate Commerce Commission. A federal agency, the commission was charged with regulating railroads, buses, and the like. In 1954, the commission rejected their case. By then, the Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka had handed down that year had outlawed segregation in public schools. Miss Roundtree approached the commission again, arguing that the Brown decision should apply equally to the transportation. On November 7, 1955, the commission issued its decision, banning segregation on interstate bus travel. The ruling will not be enforced for 6 years. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy pressured the commission to do so amid the violence against freedom riders in the South in 1961. After the AME Church approved the ordination of women in 1960, Miss Roundtree entered Howard's Divinity School and was ordained the next year ministering at Allen Chapel AME Church in Washington before retiring. She died at the age of 104 in 2018.
When World War I broke out in April of 1917, there were 4 all-black regiments, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the 24th and 25th Infantry. Within 1 week of Wilson's declaration of war, the War Department had stopped accepting black volunteers because the quotas for African Americans had been filled. War Department planners quickly realized that the Standing Army of 126,000 men would not be enough. The standard volunteer system proved to be inadequate in raising an army. So on 18 May 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act. African American males from all over the country eagerly joined the war effort. The four established all-black regular Army regiments in 1917 were fully complemented, and blacks could not join white units. Backlash from the African American community prompted the War Department to finally create the 92nd and 93rd Divisions, both primarily black combat units. With the creation of African American units, demand came for African American officers. The War Department thought the soldiers would be more likely to follow men of their own color, thereby reducing the risk of any sort of uprising. Most leaders of the African American community agreed, and it was decided that the Army would create a segregated but supposedly equal officers training camp. In May of 1917, Fort Des Moines opened its doors to black officer trainees. On October 15, 1917, 639 African American men received their commissions and were assigned to the 92nd Division. This would be the first and only class to graduate from Fort Des Moines. The War Department shut it down soon after their departure. Black officers continued to be trained, however, at other facilities in Puerto Rico and elsewhere in the programs with white officers.
Mrs. Bethune had decided that you were going to be one of the first.
Ms. Bethune decided that.
Right. Mm-hmm. That you were going to be one of the first 40 African American women, young women, to go into this military corps.
Yes.
Now, how did she tell you that?
She told me that one day, one summer day. I came up to Washington. I had to wait 2 days. I had no place to stay. That all sticks out of my mind. I did go to the Y, and they took me in. But when I finally got to see her, which was the next day around noon, I think she came in from a meeting or something, she sat down with me and she began to talk about her fears. In fact, she cried. She had had some disappointment, and I was not a part of it, and she didn't share it with me. But she was deeply concerned that black women didn't seem to latch on, you know?
Latch on?
Latch on to whatever it was she was trying to do. And you know, that is a disappointing thing. I had it in the Army. Girls didn't see it, say, well, I don't want to be in no trouble. I said, but the book says that's wrong. And that doesn't mean anything to people who, by virtue of their circumstances, just can't see clearly common sense things of government, of life in general in the community. And so you have to work around it. That's what I've learned, is you have to work around some things.
And she was sitting there, and she had obviously gone through this disappointment, whatever it was.
Well, yeah.
And she was tearing up, but then she started talking to you
Yeah,
about her plans for your future.
That's right. Yeah, she said, you got to do this, you got to do that, and what she was doing, and that there was going to be some education legislation. I couldn't fathom education, you know, legislation, but it was. The various bills for education grants and all that kind of stuff, which really included a lot of people, me for one. And before I got to that, though, then I went in the Army.
Well, now, when she said to you, I want you to do this, I want you to go into the Army.
Yeah.
How did you feel about that?
How did I feel?
Yeah.
Well, I tell you what I said to her. Well, I have talked to my mother about that. That was my soul. In other words, I really wanted to get it off of me. But the more I got into it, and when I talked to Mama, Mama didn't seem a bit surprised. she didn't want me to go, but she thought women would have to go.
Now, why were you, obviously, you weren't all that sure that this was a good idea for you.
No.
Why not?
Well, I didn't know what it entailed, and there was still the wives' old tale that the women were being brought into the service to serve as concubines for the men. They were going to send them to Huachuca, you know, where most black men were sent in large numbers and that kind of thing. And that would be our function, to be their mates. Well, of course, no woman would want to come into a situation like that. And it took education from leaders and others to back down those kind of negative notions.
But it turned out that what Mrs. Bethune wanted to do was, in fact, to begin desegregating
the whole thing,
the entire military.
That's where she was.
And you were going to be part of that vanguard, the first
right.
40
43,
black women,
yes, that's it.
who were going to be coming in with whites as officers
Of
to
the
be
Corps.
trained.
Yeah, and that's the way it turned out. She and Miss Harvey, Miss Roosevelt, and there were several other women, leading women around the country, governors' wives and whatnot, who worked hard to counter the notion that we were going to be out there to be mates for the men. And that would be our major function. Well, in the first place, there would have been enough women to go around. True, they sent a contingent to Fort Huachuca, but there wouldn't have been nearly enough. All the men in Fort Huachuca.
But you got sent to Des Moines?
Yes.
Was it Fort Des Moines?
Our way.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
Well, tell me what happened when you first got there. Were you welcomed?
Well, men, no. Men, you know, sometimes you just got to act like a man, like the others are acting. And they didn't want to be there. They didn't want to be assigned there to train us. And that was their mission. In 90 days to really have us ready to turn out in the uniform. And I guess some of them, as I have heard later, resented it. They wanted to be going on to the military duty. And this can turn out to be the hardest military duty they had ever conceived, you know. But what they didn't count on was women are determined. And we stayed up late nights studying those manuals and making it so we would understand. The hardest part was the footwork out there in that cold weather. Even in August it's cold in Des Moines, out there in the woods where we were housed and where the barracks were. It was very uncomfortable, and the parade ground hadn't been worked on, I'm sure, in years. And it had gopher holes on it, and girls were spraining their ankles. I sprained mine. And you just were in bad shape. I said many nights, I want to go home. That's what I want to do. Mildred Carter said, yeah, I want to go too, Johnson. I want to go too. I'm ready to go today. I said, well, we can't go today now. We can go, but we got to make plans. I always believe in making some plans.
When we recorded this story, Colonel Gorham L. Black III was occasioned to be in Washington, D.C. for the purpose of attending the funeral of the Honorable Togo D. West, Jr., who died at the age of 75 on March 8, 2018. The funeral was held at the National Cathedral on the 23rd of April. Colonel Gorham L. Black III was a classmate at Howard University with the Honorable Togo West, who served this nation as the Secretary of Veteran Affairs and Secretary of the Army. He was a government lawyer who exemplified the success of African Americans in the U.S. military following the period when men like him broke barriers as a result of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. A high-ranking Clinton administration official, the Honorable Togo West, exemplified the success of African Americans through his success. when he oversaw Army investigations into sexual harassments, served 2 rocky years as Secretary of Veteran Affairs, and later directed investigations into the mistreatment of veterans at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C., and the roots of the 2009 mass shooting in Fort Hood, Texas. Secretary West initially worked as an electrical engineer, but after receiving his bachelor's degree from Howard University in 1965, he switched to law, graduating from Howard's Law School, #1 in his class, in 1968. The son of a North Carolina school teacher, he became the second African American to serve as Army Secretary when President Bill Clinton nominated him to the post in September 1993. In perhaps his most prominent action as Army Secretary, Secretary West ordered an investigation into the senior officers responsible for the sexual abuse at Aberdeen Proving Grounds, where 3 male instructors were charged with rape and other sex crimes against female recruits in 1996. More than 50 recruits eventually came forward with allegations of sexual abuse at the base. He went on to launch an investigation into each Army base that trains female soldiers and appointed a 9-member civilian military panel that proposed changes in Army training and sexual harassment policies. Secretary West was a senior vice president and top lobbyist at Northrop Grumman before joining the Clinton administration as both Army Secretary and chair of the Panama Canal Commission.